Hello and welcome to EM360 Live, a monthly live Q&A where we pick the brains of some of the most influential people shaking up the enterprise tech space. My name is Matt Harris, head of content here at EM360, and today I'm joined by Alex Beavan. Alex has dedicated his career to cybersecurity and has spent his career working with counterterrorism units and law enforcement organizations. He is now the head of fraud prevention at Convera. Today, I'll be speaking with Alex about current banking turmoil and how that's exacerbating cyber fraud. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
Alex, could you just let the people know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Alex Beavan. I currently head up fraud training, anti-bribery and corruption at Convera. I've been doing that for the last 5 years. Prior to that, I did 30 years in law enforcement, and the last 19 years were in the counterterrorism command, working with obviously intelligence agencies, primarily with regard to fraud investigation and intelligence development. So, a long and varied career, getting a bit older and grey now, but certainly still in the fight against the fraudsters.
Nice one. Fighting the good fight. Love to hear it. So obviously I kind of wanted to bring you on today. First of all, to just kind of help set the scene about, the current banking sector globally. And obviously, we've seen the cost of living crisis here in the UK, and obviously things like the SVB collapse over in the States. Financially across the world, what do you feel like is happening right now? And do you feel as though that turmoil is really helping to breed that cybercrime and that environment for fraud?
I think personally, I think what we're seeing is more ready victims. If you think about the pandemic, we had issues with regard to businesses during that period, and now with the cost of living crisis, we have everyone looking to make money, exploit opportunities. Everyone is short because of obviously the situation, and that creates a sort of issue that there are more ready victims out there. And the fraudsters are always one step ahead. They are opportunists. They are preparing, be it with regard to websites, whatever it may be. But they're out there, and they're exploiting this situation or this continuing situation. And I think coming to your point about what I see with regard to the banks are still very fixated with regard to dealing with what they're required to under the regulations. I don't see in my time working now in the private sector that the banks are increasingly more concerned with regard to the victims. I think they're very much tied down with regard to legislation around data protection, privacy, and I don't see that sort of link up. I think that the best example I can give you is when I was in law enforcement. If you would phone up a bank with regard to, say, a terrorism inquiry, you get all the cooperation that you needed. When I started dealing with the victims of fraud, I would phone up a bank and it would be nigh impossible to work with them to recover the money very quickly with regard to a victim of fraud. And I found it exasperating. These people are losing their life savings, and we are finding it incredibly difficult to work with banks, particularly internationally, with regard to recovering money. So there's a disconnect. It's dysfunctional. It's not aimed towards ultimately the most important people, as I say, which is the victims of crime.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to kind of bring that into the business sense a little bit more, how are fraudsters really going about targeting those businesses, and where do BEC scams come in?
So I think the important thing here is that they're targeting businesses, indiscriminately. We're not talking about the $100 million business email compromises. The average sort of business email compromise is with regard to an SME style size company, sort of $35,000-$40,000, and that is done indiscriminately. It's not targeting any particular sector. So that may start with regard to a phishing expedition by the fraudsters, all these sort of organized crime groups that exist. They are trying to find a live invoice situation involving a company. They're trying to find all different types of opportunities with regard to fraud, but they actually are quite organized, hence the name. They have particular units that are dealing with potential in and around business email compromise. So once a sort of phishing exploit is found where someone has pressed on a link, and we all have that on ourselves on an everyday basis. We all get those emails. They are in a position to see a developing invoice situation, a developing payment situation, and they exploit it very easily. And it is incredibly frustrating. Now, coming back to your first question, you talked about the banking industry. One of the things I've seen where we have made steps, particularly in the UK, is around confirmation of payee. So that is directly targeting the associated, the APP scams like the business email compromise. And it's been very successful. We've all seen it with regard to our own banking. Whenever you want to make a payment now, it tells you, if the details are correct with regard to the account. But most of business payments are international, and banks around the world are not practicing confirmation of pay. So the sort of platform for these fraudsters to exploit with regard to business email compromise is very open, I would say. That they don't have confirmation of pay. They're not checking the names on the instructions. It's just being paid automatically into account, and you can monetize it very quickly. We're in a sort of situation. We have created a perfect storm. People want to control their own money. They want to transfer that money very quickly, and then that's the same for the fraudsters, so they can exploit that situation very quickly. So as I say, we're in a situation where the banking industry as it stands, and the ease of doing a business email compromise is such that it is incredibly hard to stop these once they're going.
Yeah, you mentioned there about the kind of ease of these scams. We were actually talking, but before we jumped on today, and you were saying that if you were a cyber attacker, you would be doing BEC scams. Is that down to just how easy it is, how easy it is to kind of replicate it at scale and launch them at scale?
Well, it is easy because the practice, the proof is in the pudding, as I say. You see with regard to victims of these sort of scams, how they are duped by just one email. They could be doing business for a number of years, where they're paying to one bank on one side of the world, and then they receive an email purporting to be their customer, purporting to be their supplier, who instructs them to not use that bank account and use a different bank account, and they are duped by that. I mean, I think the classic example was during the pandemic. There was a company that was deceived by one email that said, don't pay it into this bank account, pay into that bank account, and the reason they gave was the bank manager had died of COVID. Now, we're in the 21st century. A bank is not going to be able to not work because the bank manager has died of COVID. But that is, that's a classic example of how it takes one email, just one email, for companies around the world to be deceived, whether it's the CFO or whether it's someone working in the invoice section. So business email compromise, by virtue of the stats, we're talking about 46 billion now since 2016, according to the FBI. By virtue of my experience of what I've seen, suggests to me that we aren't further forward with regard, or significantly further forward with regard to stopping this. So it is a pretty easy scam to undertake. So yes, if I was doing fraud, it would be business email compromise, most certainly, unfortunately.
Okay, it's not you though, right?
Absolutely not. No, I'm trying to stop it. So, but it is easy, unfortunately, because it relies on human traits. It relies on the situation where a business, and coming back to your first question as to the cost of living crisis, we're talking about businesses and individuals who are concentrating on making money. They're trying to keep their head above water. So their first thought is to do the business. Their first thought is not the fraud. So they're not thinking about potentially this email is going to be from a fraudster trying to do a business email compromise. So it relies on those human traits of, I'm too busy, I'm not thinking I'm going to be a victim of fraud, that sort of situation. And that's why they actually happen in truth, because fraud isn't number one. And that takes me on to my most favorite topic is, why isn't it number one? Why, in a situation where, particularly in the UK, we talk about fraud figures and how much they've escalated, why isn't there, literature, coordination out there which is driving the message home to these potential victims that fraud is at such a level, and this is what you need to prevent that fraud. I don't see that. I don't see these sort of, you may see it on social media sites, where it's set up for business or whatever it may be, but I don't see it on, on the BBC or ITV or whatever it may be, where the message is being driven home, with regard to these sort of scams. And, the same with regard to investment scams. I know the FCA have done a lot of work and the NCA have done a lot of work in around these spaces, but I would like to see that message constantly. We have to continually remind people about how these scams are done and how you can prevent it. And it's not about spending a lot of money. Let's be honest, business email compromise can be stopped by one phone call. Why isn't that message out there constantly with regard to it?
Yeah, I just wanted you to kind of touch on the protection side of it briefly, because I know Convera also has some very good stats about how much you've reduced instances of BEC since 2018. How do you really go about coming up with a strategy for protecting your company against that?
Well, I think the reality is it's not protecting the company, it's protecting the customer. And that's the most important thing. We have reduced instances of BEC by 50% during that period. And the way we went about it is, how does the fraud actually happen? What are the pinch points in relation to the fraud? Where can it be stopped? Yes, it could be stopped by, transaction screening, but it can also be stopped by outreach, and finding, as I say, the pinch points. So we concentrated a lot on outreach, events where we're speaking to the customer, providing literature to the customers in and around business email commerce. We're training up their staff as well. We rolled out twice yearly training for our employees, empowered them very much to become part of the fraud team. And I say part of the fraud team wasn't massive, but everyone in the business was in the fraud team. They all became part of the fraud team because they were on the front line trying to stop the fraud. So we, as I say, trained people up both inside and outside, looked at the control points, looked at where we could actually stop the fraud, brought in things like beneficiary script, and it was very successful. It was the employees that were stopping. They were effectively turning around the situation to say to the customer, to say to the company, effectively, we believe this is to be business email compromise. Have you confirmed the beneficiary changes? And they would go away. They hadn't made the phone call, they hadn't done the due diligence, and they started to do the due diligence, and the fraud's getting stopped. And that was the way we went about it. And as I say, coming back to my point before, is it's not complicated. Business email compromise is not complicated. You just have to pick up the phone. I realize in an international sort of situation where you're in different time zones, it can be difficult. But the reality is, would you sort of put that aside when you're talking about 100,000, 200,000 transactions? No, you'd make sure you've confirmed that. And, we're talking about transactions which could be business ending. That's the sort of scale can be with regard to business BEC. So you've got to do the due diligence. And that's what we're trying to encourage these companies, these customers to do that due diligence, to pick up the phone.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and very, very articulately put there. Well, we've got a few messages coming in from our audience. And the first one is from Fraser from YouTube. And he says, hey, Alex, he wants to know how easy BEC scams are to conduct, which I think you've already mentioned. And he also wants to know what industries and regions are A, most likely to be hit, and also B, where are the attacks most likely to emanate from?
I mean, the second part of the question is really important. I think the reality is, as I said before, industries that are susceptible business, like all of them. I've seen all of them hit, and with regard to countries, where the victims are and where the sort of frauds are emanating. I think the one of the things that always struck me was back in 2016, 2017, the FBI talked about 25% of the time China and Hong Kong was where the money went in the first instance with regard to a business email compromise, where the money was redirected to. And we did stats at the time and showed that to be the case. They don't sort of mention that now, the FBI. And I would say from our sort of research that the sort of market, in inverted commas, where the money goes to in the first instance with regard to the fraud is a lot more varied. So you can't sort of say, it's a case of If it goes to China, it's always going to be a business email compromise. It is actually quite varied. We saw sort of instances during the pandemic of Indonesia coming to the rise. So it is very varied. I think the way I would look at it is the red flags in relation to this. You know, the fact that you are changing country with regard to a payment is an indicator. It's not so much where the different country is, it's the fact that there is a change. We're talking about you're going to make a payment to, say, the UK because your supplier is in the UK, and then you receive instructions to say, don't make it to that bank in the UK, make it to a bank on the other side of the world. Well, common sense, coming back to what I said about business email compromise being a sort of human thing, common sense dictates that that is suspicious in itself. So coming back to the question, you know, it used to be China and Hong Kong. It's now a lot more varied, but the fact that it's in a different country is the big tell.
Sure. And which regions were most likely to be hit? Was that primarily in the West, or?
Well, I mean, I would say that, you know, the markets where the victims were primarily was the US and the UK, and Australia particularly. That's a lot to do with the proximity to China and Hong Kong. Those were the sort of where the victims were. But, you know, we've seen instances across Europe. We've seen instances, you know, in the Far East. You know, Singapore and Hong Kong has been quite prevalent as well. It's all over the place. That's the thing about business email compromise, is that the fraudster is not sitting there saying, well, I'm going to target companies in Singapore or Hong Kong. They're sending out those phishing messages indiscriminately to email addresses, hoping that someone presses on a link. They don't really care where the country is or what sector it is, as long as there's a transaction in the process that they can effectively manipulate. So they're not, I'll say, we're not talking about targeted phishing here, you know, chasing after a company doing 100 million. We're just talking about indiscriminate, and that is the bulk of business email compromise, indiscriminate.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And then I've also got Jesse, who asks, does AI now play a part in conducting these BEC scams? And could AI
Excellent
also
question.
be, and she also asks, could AI be used to defend against them as well?
I mean, that's an excellent question. Yeah, we've seen the rise of the fake videos. We've seen the rise of people using the Zoom and, you know, those sort of Teams platforms where, you know, there was a case where, you know, people were in that sort of environment, and someone was pretending to be a CEO. They didn't have their picture up, like we're a live video now. They said, look, I'm not feeling too well. Went onto the chat, did all the chat sort of conversation, answered questions there with regard to the meeting that we're having, and then instructed someone in that meeting to make a transaction, you know, on behalf of the company, as I say, pretending to be the CEO. So we've seen the fraudsters now, with regard to business email compromise, move into the sort of virtual platform. We have seen instances with regard to, you know, using the fake voice situation with regard to a particular business email compromise, a very large scale one. I haven't as yet seen instances where they've created the one-time fake video. You need to have an interactive situation with regard to that. So, you know, it's getting there. They are moving to that, but I come back right back to what you said earlier about, you know, why is it so easy? That you don't need to do all that sort of thing. You don't need to do the AI. You don't need to have the voice sort of stuff. If you can do it via one email, why would you spend money, you know, trying to do a fraud that way when you only actually need one email? Coming back to the other part of the question about, are we using AI? Well, I think we use stuff like to protect the cloud email accounts, but at the moment you don't need to do too much to stop it. Again, it's an easy crime to perpetrate because you might only need one email, but it's also an easy crime to stop. You just got to pick up the phone. I say it's not complicated, both ends of the sort of spectrum here.
Yeah, yeah, I see that for sure, and I definitely think, you know, some personal red flags for me, if I was in that kind of situation, would be, you know, if I had a superior member of staff out of the blue just asking me for like an Amazon gift card or something like that. To go a little bit more technical with it, Jack on the YouTube channel asks, what are some red flags that you can really look out for as a business, you know, as these attacks get more and more sophisticated?
I mean, well, there are 8 red flags primarily with regard to business email compromise. As I sort of mentioned, with regard to the change of country, you have the email address itself. The lookalike email address is very sort of prevalent with regard to these business email compromise. The content of the email itself. I could go on and on, spend all day talking about this. There are other things that you can use with regard to technology. The IP address with regard to the email that's sent in with the new instructions. Is it the same IP address that you have with regard to that particular company? Has it now changed to a different part of the world? They don't tend to use IP masking and things like that. Like I say, the people that are doing this are not high tech. It's not, I have to sort of not give them too much credit here. They're not sitting there in sort of master Dr. Evil situation. They're sitting there in cafes with laptops, sending out these emails with a simple email. So you don't have to get too complicated. It's the basic red flags. Like I say, change of country. It could be change of the beneficiary. We've seen that as well. There are simple red flags which I could go through and provide to anyone with regard to how you stop business, to find a business email compromise. And I come back to the simple point is, do the due diligence, pick up the phone. You do not need to worry too much about the IT side, but the IT side can help with regard to, say, the cloud sort of email accounts and the IP addresses.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you for that. Guys, thank you so much for your questions. My last question today, Alex, is from myself, and it's a question that I ask all of the guests on our show, and that is, if you could swap jobs with anyone for a day, who would it be and why?
Well, I could talk about football, but I won't. But I think the reality is, if I could change, it would be someone in government, potentially the Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary or even the Prime Minister, to actually get this going, to spend a lot more energy on something that's really important to the public. The public are losing a lot of money with regard to these sort of scams. They need help. They need to have that knowledge. They need to have that education as to what they can do. We've seen a lot of work done by the PSR with regard to, the confirmation of pay, and that's great, but we need to go much more. And I don't want fraud to become an afterthought. It's being left out of stats when they're having media interviews. Well, that's ridiculous. Fraud is a really important crime to the public, so we need to have more done. So I would certainly grab that job for a day and make sure that was the case.
Nice. You don't fancy replacing Pep or Klopp anytime soon, then?
No, Klopp's doing good enough for me, and I certainly wouldn't be going to Man City. So there you go.
Nice one, Alex. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Where can people go to learn more about you and learn more about Convera?
Well, we have a Convera website. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to help anyone with regard to this sort of fraud prevention. So yeah, I'm out on the internet. Please shoot me an email. I'll provide you all the information that I can with regard to it. I say this is a joint thing. We're not. It's not. I'm not going to keep it to myself. The answers are out there. We all want people not to suffer and be victims of crime. So we all have to work together with regard to it. It's about getting that message out, but constantly getting that message out.
Yeah, and obviously education is super important. So yeah, guys, that's
absolutely.
Convera.com.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll be back next week with another episode in our live stream. But until then, follow the conversation on our socials at EM360 Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, please head on over to em360tech.com. Cheers, Alex.
Thank you.